the great musical gift and heritage of the hymns of the church, which hold us by reminding us of the faithfulness of God. Or you're turning with me in your Bibles to the book of Matthew, particularly the 27th chapter. All weekend long, I have been soliciting prayers of God's people. Alexander, I find myself in a season where God is stretching both my thinking and my theology. And although it is my desire to wrestle privately with God, it sometimes spills over into my proclamation of who I sense God to be. And so I pray today that God would guide both mind and mouth, and to be used in a way that speaks truth to power. In the 27th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, I want to begin reading in the 32nd verse from the New King James Version of the Word, and ask those who are physically able to stand with us that together we might reverence the reading and the hearing of God's Word from Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse number 32. Now, as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and him they compelled to bear the cross of Jesus. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave Jesus sour wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he had tasted it, he would not drink. Then they crucified him and divided his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Sitting down, they kept watch over him there, and they put up over his head the accusation written against him: "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. For today and for the next 4 weeks, I'd like to talk, teach, and preach from a series that I want to entitle Enemy of the State. You may be seated in the presence of God. Enemy of the state. If you're like me and you were raised in church, if you spent any amount of time in Sunday school class, if you're old enough to know what BTU is, then like you, I was raised with a very passive and pleasant portrait of Jesus Christ. Dr. Faith, Jesus for me was the blonde-haired, blue-eyed brother whose hands were folded, was looking up into heaven praying on the front of that cardboard fan that had Leak Funeral Home on the back. Jesus was that image in the stained glass window in the back of church of a shepherd with arms wide open, gentle as sheep grazed all around. I was raised envisioning a Jesus that Deacon Dodie Nash would pray about every Sunday morning when he knelt at the altar. He prayed the same prayer every week. And at the end of the prayer, he began to hum and pray at the same time. Let's have a little talk with Jesus. And he'd remind us that there's not a friend like the lowly Jesus. I remember sitting in second grade Sunday school with Sister Elizabeth Long, as she told me in no uncertain terms that if I died unsaved, I was going to hell. And I gave my life to Jesus on general principle right then and right there. Because she told me that Jesus came that I might go to heaven. I remember going to vacation Bible school and learning about a Jesus who was long-suffering. A Jesus who was kind and compassionate. A Jesus who taught us how to love our enemies. A Jesus who taught us how to pray to God. And a Jesus whose only fault was to proclaim himself to be the Messiah, which aggravated some unrighteous Pharisees, who delivered him into the hands of Pilate and forced him to be crucified, though he knew no sin. It was in that vacation Bible school and Sunday school and Baptist training union that my Baptist came out, because I learned that he died on Friday. You do know I'm Baptist. He stayed dead on Saturday. But early on Sunday morning, he rose with all power in his hands, and that because of him, I can live eternally. That he came to right my relationship with God. And while I await his return, I've got to live like him and love like him and practice my faith like him and love those who hate me and pray for them that use me and be kind to those who speak evil to me. Jesus came to get my religion right, my spirituality, my walk with God. But I would argue with you today and over the next 4 Sundays that picture of a pleasant, tame, and mild Jesus is more of a caricature than an actual portrayal. That when you really look at the life of Jesus, you'll find out that his ministry was much more than pray and love your enemies. I want to suggest to you that the Lord came not simply to teach us how to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but that when you look at the life of Jesus, you see a man who is intimately concerned not just with spiritual things, but earthly realities. That Jesus has a message about politics and economics and social justice. That in Jesus we have a Savior who is not only compassionate about our suffering, but who came to address and alleviate the causes of our suffering. That Jesus does not just speak about spiritual things, but about systematic oppression of people on earth. Hear me, beloved, Jesus is a political revolutionary who critiqued the social structures of his day, who damned the economic policies that allowed the rich to prosper at the expense of the poor. A Jesus who was concerned about our justice and our oppression, that he did not come just to give us a highway to heaven, but he came to talk about the hell on earth. And that our faith is not just pie in the sky, but ought to be some steak by the lake. That the Lord is concerned about social injustice, political oppression, and economic inequality. So much so that when Jesus goes to Nazareth on the Sabbath, he goes into the synagogue, as was his custom, and with all the scriptures of Israel that he could have read from, he picks up the scroll of Isaiah. He goes down to chapter 61. And this is what he says about himself. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who have been held captive by Roman imperialism, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. That acceptable year of the Lord is the year of Jubilee, when Israel was called to release all debt and return all land to its original owners. And Jesus says, don't get it twisted. I didn't just come to tell you about heaven. I came to change the hell of the earth that you live on. And I've come to address the oppression of Rome, the economic exploitation of the poor at the hands of the rich, to deal with the injustices that my people face. Jesus was political. He was economic. He was social. And to limit Jesus to spiritual and religious realities is to miss who he really was. Now, some of you may have difficulty accepting a political revolutionary named Jesus. Your blonde-haired, blue-eyed, praying on the front of a fan Jesus can't be equated with the Jesus who tried to turn the world upside down. And if you have trouble accepting that Jesus was about more than spiritual and religious realities, you've got to ask yourself two questions. How did Jesus die, and why did he die? How did Jesus die, and why did he die? Now, before you get all Baptist on me and want to quote scripture and go to Isaiah and tell me he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, and the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Let me remind you that Jesus did not just die. He was killed. No, Ed, he wasn't just killed. He was executed. He may have died for your sins, but he was killed for something else. Jesus was executed by crucifixion. Crucifixion was a Roman state-endorsed execution. Crucifixion was a political lynching. It was meant to inflict as much pain as possible for as long as possible upon its victims, who would hang in public as a visible display to all who walk by. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome. And that is the death that Jesus dies. Jesus does not pass away in hospice. He is crucified on a cross by a Roman Empire who saw him as a threat to their power. That's why when you read in Matthew and in Luke and in John, you must take note of the inscription that is put at the top of the cross. Here is Jesus, King of the Jews. Beloved, understand that that is a criminal charge of treason by Rome. That Rome looked at Jesus and said, listen, there's but one king over the earth, and his name is Caesar. And when we crucify you, your charge is treason because you claim to be king when there's only one king. And Jesus was crucified under the charge of treason for all the world to see. Nobody challenges Caesar. Jesus was not killed because he upset the religious sensibilities of the Pharisees. Jesus was not killed because he walked on water and turned water into wine. His execution had nothing to do with claiming to be God. Jesus was crucified for political reasons because Rome looked at him and saw him as the leader of a rebellion that threatened their domination over Israel, and he had to be killed. Treason is not spiritual, it's political. And the very fact that he's executed for treason, the very fact that the sign says, this is Jesus, King of the Jews, the very fact that he was seen by Rome as a revolutionary and a rebellious leader, Dustin, that in and of itself contradicts the watered down, diluted, tempered image of Jesus that many of us were raised with. If all Jesus did was talk about heaven, he would never have been executed. William Herzog, in his book, Jesus, Justice, and the Reign of God, puts it like this. If Jesus had been the kind of teacher popularly portrayed in North American churches, teaching only about the importance of spirituality and a private relationship with God, he would have been supported by Rome as part of their rural pacification program, because that was exactly the kind of religion Romans wanted peasants to have, ones that did not touch on politics or economics. Herzog goes on to argue that if all Jesus did was teach us to love our enemies, he never would have been nailed to a cross. But the fact that he is executed declares that Rome saw him as an enemy of the state. He was a threat to their power. And I would argue with you that if you claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ and you are not a threat to anything, then maybe you ought to check your discipleship. If you are comfortable and cozy with lottie-dottie and everybody and everything that happens in the world, and your presence is not a threat, you might not be Christian. By definition, we threaten society. The problem is that our image of Jesus, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, hands crossed, looking up to heaven, has been stripped of the radicality, the revolutionary, the rebellious, the social, the economic, the injustices and oppression that Jesus spoke about have all been washed away. And we've been left with a sanitized, politically correct, religious Jesus who is locked into the sanctuary of Christian churches. Part of the reason we miss how radical Jesus is, Sister Joyce, is because our world is so far removed from the world Jesus lived in. And because we don't know the context of the world in which he lived, we sometimes miss how rebellious he really was. Let me give you an example. So, at Little Progressive Missionary Baptist Church, 10706 South Michigan, on the south side of Chicago, every Sunday morning, we used to sing the Lord's Prayer. And not the fast version. The long, drawn-out, 18, 19-minute version. And in that prayer, we would lift up what we thought were spiritual words. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we prayed that prayer so much that we have missed how absolutely radical it was. Because when Jesus taught his disciples to pray like that, there was only one name that was supposed to be hallowed over the earth. That was the name of Caesar. And so Jesus teaches us to pray rebellious, radical prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name and thy name alone. And thy kingdom come, not just in heaven, but on earth. And when your kingdom comes, Rome has to go. When your kingdom comes, oppression has to end. When your kingdom comes, justice must be done. It is a revolutionary prayer to argue in an era where Israel was held in inescapable debt to say, forgive us our debt as we forgive our debtors. Jesus was radical and revolutionary, but we miss it because we don't know the context of the world in which he lived. So for the next 4 weekends, I want to invite you into the world of Jesus. I want us to move beyond the politically correct, sanitized caricature of Jesus and look at the real Jesus. And look at how it is that Jesus was deemed an enemy of the state because of what he taught and said. I would that you join in with me over the next few weekends of looking at how Jesus aggravated 4 earthly powers: Herod, the Pharisees, Caiaphas, and Pilate. Those 4 conspired together to deem Jesus an enemy of the state. And as we make our way to Easter Sunday and shout about the resurrection, I think we ought to at least understand why he was killed. What is the message of Jesus that is so threatening that he would be executed for the messages he proclaimed? My hope is that in this series we will broaden our understanding of Jesus and see that his ministry was so much more than pray and love your enemies. That Christ is not simply about spiritual things, but earthly things. That Jesus is intimately concerned with social justice, economic equality, and political liberation. That this thing we serve as Christians, this faith we have, this Lord we worship, is not simply about some heavenly realities, but it has some earthly implications. And that we have got to embrace the authentic Jesus, not the one we have in 2017. Now, if you're with me, then allow me to tell you that very quickly, and I won't be long, I really only want to answer 2 questions this morning. The first question is this, CJ: if Jesus is a radical revolutionary, and if Jesus is concerned with economics and politics and social equality, if Jesus came to preach about things on earth, how in the world did we get a tame and timid Jesus? How did we inherit a meek and mild Savior? Where did this gentle and soft around the edges Jesus come from? If Jesus was so concerned about economic exploitation that he would go to the temple, stage a revolution, turn furniture over, and whip people out the sanctuary, how did we now inherit a Jesus who supports economic exploitation? If Jesus was the Lord of the poor, where did we get a Jesus who supports capitalism and the creation of poverty? If Jesus stood against imperial Rome, where did we get this Jesus who supports imperial America? If Jesus was so inclusionary that he welcomed the poor and slaves and women into his ministry, where do we get a Jesus that we use to exclude people based on gender and color and class and sexual orientation? How is Jesus transformed? How did we get this Jesus? Well, to kind of give you an answer, I need to engage in what is going to sound like a history lecture. But that's what you get when your pastor's a PhD student. To understand how we got this Jesus, I need for just a moment to teach you about the Constantinian captivity of Christianity. Can I talk about the Constantinian captivity of Christianity? Touch your neighbor, tell them you're going to learn today. You're going to learn today. Those who study the history of Christianity know that after Jesus dies, his followers started a movement that was not a religion. In its earliest phases, the movement was called the Way. We were not called Christians. Christian, when you look at the history and etymology of the term, was a mockery that Rome used to define these followers of Christ. Christian was a way of laughing at the followers of Jesus. You Christians, you followers of an executed criminal. And as a result, early on, you're going to find, even in the book of Acts, that the followers of Jesus always suffered persecution. Rome looked at this movement as laughable because it was a movement of the poor, the underclass, the slave, women, all of whom were devalued by Rome. And so the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. It is a known fact that the Romans used Christian as sport and spectacle for Roman entertainment. Christians were forced to wear animal skins and thrown into cages with wild beasts that would tear them limb for limb at the applause of Roman citizens. Nero, the emperor, declared that Christians were the enemy of humanity. He blamed them for the burning of Rome. As a matter of fact, it is known historical fact that Nero used to take Christians, put them on poles, and light them on fire to bring light to Rome at night. Rome was illuminated by the burning flesh of Christians. Things for Christians got worse, much worse, under an emperor named Diocletian. Diocletian ruled from 303 to 311, and he believed it was his assignment to wipe Christians off the face of the earth. He criminalized Christianity and declared that anyone who professed Jesus as Lord would be killed immediately. He instituted what was called the Diocletian persecutions. Okay, say it with me, Diocletian persecution. You're going to sound so smart on your job tomorrow. The Diocletian persecutions criminalized Christianity. Well, everything took a turn on October the 27th, 312 AD. October 27, 312 AD, a Roman emperor by the name of Constantine is preparing to go to battle. And the night before he goes to battle, he has a dream where an angel gives him two Greek letters, chi and rho. Chi looks like an X, rho looks like a P. Chi, rho, Christo. It is an early Greek version of the name Christ. And Constantine says that the angel told him that under the banner of chi and rho, he would be victorious. He created this insignia that he then put on all the armor of his soldiers and went to war, killing under the banner of Jesus Christ. When he won the battle, he attributed his victory to Jesus. As a result, when he became emperor in 313, Constantine converted to Christianity, repealed the Diocletian persecutions, and made Christianity the endorsed religion of the empire. And now these Christians who had been persecuted and lit on fire and thrown to the lions, the persecutions end. The murders are over. The door to Roman society has been opened. And everybody wants to be a Christian. All of Rome wanted to be like its emperor and started joining the church. Sounds like a great moment. But Constantine's conversion and endorsement of Christianity diluted the gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that we have never recovered. What Constantine did in 313 changed the very nature of the ministry of Jesus in ways that we have yet to recover from. Because you see, beloved, when Constantine converted to the faith, he also converted the faith to Constantine. Christianity did not change Constantine. He was never baptized until a few hours before his death. He never took communion. And even after professing Jesus as Savior, he killed his wife, his firstborn son, and 5 other members of his family who he felt were a threat to his throne. All in the name of Jesus. And when Christianity was endorsed by the Roman Empire, Roman culture changed the essence of Christianity in 3 major ways. Can I keep teaching? Number 1, Constantine declared himself to be head of the church. Y'all, that's something Jesus never did. And when Constantine declares himself to be head of the church, he infuses into Christianity something that had never been there: hierarchy, class, status, religious elitism. Prior to Constantine, the leaders of the church never saw themselves better than anyone else who worshiped God. There was equality because that's what Jesus preached. But under Constantine, hierarchy shows up. Under Constantine, you get the term reverend, right reverend, Holy Father, Pope. And all of a sudden, Christianity has what it has never known: status among preachers. Father, Reverend, Right Reverend, Bishop, Archbishop, Presiding Prelate, Pope. And now Christianity has endorsed a hierarchy that was never part of the ministry of Jesus. Not only is there a hierarchy introduced, but now Christianity is used to support Greco-Roman values. Things that were foreign to Christianity now become Christian. For example, class status, slavery, women's subjugation by men. None of that was in the ministry of Jesus. But now that Rome owns Christianity, women's subjugation is godly, and you ought to keep quiet in the church. And the worst crime was that Rome partnered its military domination of the world with Christianity. Rome did not stop its wars. It did not stop killing. It did not stop execution. It did not stop warmongering. No, now Rome went to war with God on their side, with Jesus at their head. And when you put God on your political side, you will kill people without impunity, because it's your God-given destiny. The faith of Jesus was changed so much that Aubrey Hendricks, in his book, The Politics of Jesus, says this: the message of Jesus has been so perverted and distorted that if Jesus were alive today, surely he would stand against the very religion that bears his name. Jesus would look at our religion and declare it has nothing to do with him. Now, I know because it's real quiet in here that some are asking, Reverend, why is this important? I mean, what's your point in all this? Why get into the cultural world of Jesus and suggest that the Jesus we have is not the authentic Jesus? Well, allow me to answer that question in the conclusion of this sermon. Those who study Bible and remember the life of Jesus know that when Jesus began his earthly ministry, the Bible says that he was driven into the wilderness for 40 days of fasting. And after those 40 days of fasting, he has an encounter with Satan that takes the form of 3 temptations. The temptations are turn stone to bread. The second temptation is to go up to the top of the temple and jump, and angels will catch you. And the third temptation is to bow down to Satan so that Satan will give you all the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus deals with those temptations. The gospel writer Luke says this, that after Satan was defeated in the wilderness, he left Jesus for a more opportune time. Satan says to Jesus, I'll be back. These temptations are not done. And I would argue with you that the followers of Christ since that moment have always been confronted with the 3 temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness, and we have failed to conquer them the way Christ has. Why is this important? Because we are not living in the authentic ministry of Jesus Christ when we fail those temptations. Reverend, what do you mean? Well, stay with me. The first temptation is to turn stones into bread. Faith, this is the temptation to use all the power God has given you to take care of yourself. This is the temptation to take all the blessings of God and spend them on yourself. This is the temptation that has destroyed the witness of Jesus Christ, called individuality. Detaching yourself from the welfare of your brother and your sister and believing that your walk with God is just me, myself, and I. This belief that you and God is just you and God. This belief that your worship ought to just be about you. That your religion is not connected to somebody else. It is a distortion of the message of Jesus to believe that faith is just between you and God. It's a temptation to see someone else struggle and feel no compulsion of the Holy Spirit to aid and assist. It's a temptation to witness somebody else's oppression and simply say, thank God that ain't me. It's a temptation to see their struggle on television and think turning the channel makes it go away. It's a temptation to believe that everything God does for you is just for you. It's a temptation to build walls, close borders, draw lines in the sand to isolate you from everybody else. Me versus you, us versus them, Christian versus Muslim, American versus immigrant, hetero versus homo, black versus white, rich versus poor, educated versus ignorance, handsome versus ugly. It is this isolationism that causes you to adopt the European Descartesian philosophy of cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am. But our philosophy is not European. Because out of the depths of Africa comes a philosophy called Ubuntu. That I am because we are. And I recognize that I cannot be my best without helping you be your best. That the true message of Jesus is to remind ourselves we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. That your struggle affects my life. That injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I cannot sit in Alfred Street Sunday after Sunday, clapping my hands, running around church, shouting to God, and claim to love a God I've never seen, and fail to love the people I see every day. We must remind ourselves that when I see the homeless, I see Jesus. When I see HIV positive, I see Jesus. When I see the refugee fleeing from war in her land, I see Jesus. When I see that incarcerated brother struggling with addiction, I see Jesus. For as much as you've done it to the least of these, come on, Bible reader, you have done it unto me. The temptation of individuality. But here's the second temptation. Satan says, listen, I'm going to take you to the top of the temple. I'm going to take you to the pinnacle. And I want you to jump and call on angels to save you. Dean Garrett, this is the temptation to get to the top, to do what God never called you to do, and expect God to always save you. It is the temptation to believe that because you're at the top, you can do whatever you want, and God always has your back. To get to the top, we mistakenly think that God is always with us. But I wish you'd read the Bible correctly, that it's not God who takes Jesus to the top. It's Satan who puts him up there. Because everybody at the top ain't graced by God. And you stop being jealous of folk that get money and power and sit at the top, not recognizing that everybody at the top is not with God. Now, I know some of us have risen by the grace of God, but there are some who sit in power and authority who have not gotten there by the grace of God. Wish I had a Bible reader here. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers and the rulers of darkness who sit at the top. And the fallacy is to believe that if you are at the top, whatever you do, God's got you. The second great challenge to Christianity is not simply individuality, but militarism, warmongering, killing in the name of Jesus, believing that since we sit at the top, we can do whatever we want to do. And God's got us because we are a Christian nation. Jesus stood against the empire of Rome because Jesus understood no empire can dominate the world without violence. And America is the greatest empire the world has ever known. And the delusion is we want to act like we got to the top with no blood on our hands. that everything we've done, God has endorsed. Beloved, yes, this is a great land in which we live, but it's also a land that's going to have to give an account for the blood that we have shed. We're going to have to give an account for invading Iraq and killing innocents in revenge for 9/11, knowing that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. We will have to give an account that back in January, 45 was sworn in with his hand on the Bible, and 20 minutes later signed an executive order for a drone to bomb Yemen, killing 13 innocent children. We have to give an account for going to war against nations that don't even have an army, an air force, or a navy and can't fight back. We're going to have to give an account for weaponizing regimes that support our political interests, causing chaos in other countries so that we can get our oil from under their sand. You missed that. Our oil under their sand. We will give an account for the billions of dollars that were spent on the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, while at home, teachers are underpaid, homelessness and hunger is on the rise, HBCUs are shutting down, students are graduating, drowning in debt, and we got billions of dollars to go to war. The authentic witness of Jesus Christ demands that we declare Christianity and unquestioned military patriotism cannot go to bed together. Christianity and unquestioned military patriotism cannot go to bed together. Because when militarism beds down with Christianity, it produces a violent child. When militarism connects with Christianity, the Holocaust is born. When militarism connects with Christianity, manifest destiny is born. And thousands of Native Americans are killed in the name of God. When militarism and Christianity go to bed, slavery is birthed, and Africans are snatched from their land, not as immigrants, but as enslaved human beings. And we cannot allow militarism and Christianity to go to bed together. It is the temptation of individuality, the temptation of militarism, but the third one is even worse. Satan says to Jesus as to the church, bow down and I will give you all of this. The third great crime against Christianity is prosperity. The searching for material gain without recognizing who pays the price. It is the American commitment to unbridled capitalism that creates poverty, and we say nothing about it. Dustin, a teacher, said something to me this week that got me. He said, Donald Trump is not a surprise. He is the inevitable outcome of 100 years of capitalism and politics in America that says greed is good. And we did not see it coming because we benefited from it. In the words of my favorite poet, Sean Carter. For those over 45, that's Jay-Z. Sean Carter argues that a couple dollars shut up our holler. That we allowed our presence at the table of prosperity to cause us to miss what was happening to the poor. Everything that we hear in economics talks about the wealthy or the middle class, but nobody is talking about the poor. Nobody damns the fact that 90% of the world's wealth is held by less than 1% of the population. And this unbridled search for gain is absolutely contrary to the message of Jesus Christ. What a blasphemy. What a blatant blasphemy to stand in the pulpit and talk about tithes and offerings and never talk about the systems that create poverty and keep people poor. What a blasphemy to be on television and declare prophetic healing for a seed offering of $77.77 and never address the health care disparity that leaves so many people unable to afford their medication. What a shame to declare to folk, you can shout, I'll never be broke another day in my life, and not talk about how pharmaceutical companies did not want to release generic medication for HIV in Africa. What a shame. What a shame for your pastor to drive a Rolls Royce, fly in a private jet, and y'all claim 30,000 members and can't give a dime to the National Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. What a shame. How can you claim to be Christian and you check members' W-2s to make certain they tithe, but you never check their voter registration card? You never tell them to get tested for HIV. You never encourage them to mentor a fatherless young man who's out there in the world. What a shame when Christianity has given in to the gods of prosperity. And the only way you get it, Satan says, is to bow. Let me tell you why Jesus was killed. He wouldn't bow. He wouldn't bow to Caesar. He wouldn't bow to Pilate. He wouldn't bow to Herod. He wouldn't bow to Caiaphas because he recognized all of them are false gods. And I would remind you, child of God, disciple of Jesus Christ, you've got to learn to identify false gods. When you look in the mirror and see all the stuff you want, false god. When you see the stars and stripes, false god. When you see the dollar, within God we trust, false god. 1600 Pennsylvania, false god. But there is one God who reigns over all the earth, who sits in the throne of heaven, and he is the only God that we worship. So I say, let us strive not to be good American Christians, but good Christians who live in America. That my highest commitment is not to my nationality, but to my faith. Which means that every now and then, you too should be an enemy of the state. But I challenge this individual, me, myself, and I challenge the unquestioned militarism of our land. How are you going to kill in the name of God? And I challenge this unbridled lust for greed and gain. That's the authentic message of Jesus Christ. Next week, I'm going to help you understand who Herod really was and why Jesus was a threat to Herod.